Welcome to Looking for Gold, a beautiful fall autumn scene, a roadway into the distance that shows you all of the beautiful fall colors that we experience here in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure many other places also. Your drawing is fairly simple. You're drawing your roadway in and drawing some lines where some of your more prominent trees will be. I used Misket for some of the areas that I want to keep my yellows real vibrant so that my eye will follow those yellows down the roadway. If you don't want to use any Misket for this, that is absolutely fine, but you'll have to be prepared to be cautious as to where you put your colors so that you can keep some of your brightest yellows bright. We'll be using some Cad Red today. You can also use alizarin crimson or any of your red colors for this painting. We'll be using yellow ochre. Lemon yellow or cadmium yellow. Burnt umber. Some burnt sienna, which is a warmer brown color. We'll also be using some sap green. And of course, we'll be using some black. And just the slightest bit of cerulean blue for the sky. Just a tiny, tiny bit, hardly any at all, because you'll be doing that on a wet background. For your brushes, you're going to be using a nice, thick, flat 2-inch brush again, just to cover some of our big spaces quickly. You'll be using a number 6 or a 4 round, a number 2 round, and your nice thin little rigger. I also used my fan brush. This is an oil fan brush. It's firmer, but we're going to use that at the end to splatter. And definitely your sponge. This picture is a huge sponging picture, so you want to make sure you have your sponge ready. We're also going to be using some table salt, and you'll be using your Misket. I use my fine tip Misket container to put on my leaves and my fine branch lines. And if you don't have these, you can purchase these at Cheap Joe's online or at any of your arts and crafts stores. But they're wonderful for your Misket colors. Your background sky, we're just putting in a little bit of cerulean blue. So you're just going to wet that area first and brush in some cerulean blue here and there. Nothing special. You don't want to have to cover that whole area. You can leave little bits of white because that little bits of white will just be some white in the sky. No blotting, no nothing. You're just putting that in the wet area and allowing it to blend itself. If you didn't put any Misket in, you forgot, and you want to put in some Misket, now's the time that you're going to do that, because we're going to be mixing our lemon yellow and a little bit of yellow ochre, and with our biggest wide brush, we're going to be painting in all of those areas that you see as yellow. We're using the biggest brush because it just makes it easier to cover large areas. But you want your edges to be rough. You don't want just a smooth edge. And the reason you want a rough edge on this is because you're trying to show leaves at a distance. So you're not really seeing individual leaves. you're seeing just areas that are uneven and rough. So use the edge of your brush for that. You're going to be painting in most of the rest of the areas solid because there's not a lot of light that gets through, especially down towards the middle of your paper or the base of your paper. Towards the top, you can leave some open white spots because they can always be filled in later. But the top area is where the tops of the trees are, and in those areas, it's not as dense. This is yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of cadmium yellow, and you're placing that on your picture where you see all of the dense yellow colors. We're not worrying about the roadway yet. We're just going down the side of the roadway. And the same thing with the side of the roadway. You can leave that as an uneven line. I'm adding some deeper, plain yellow ochre into the mix while it's still nice and wet. And you want to place that where you want to show some different trees. You don't want to just place it everywhere. You want to actually make that color be some different trees. So you want to keep your plain lightest yellow. You don't want to lose all of that. But while it's wet, you're adding in some deeper yellow ochre. I'm also putting in some salt now because that salt is going to show where all of some individual leaves will be. And if your salt works well, you'll see by looking at this picture now how it is going to affect and give you great leafage. Now we're going to start sponging, and I'm sponging with some yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of burnt umber. What you're sponging in now are individual trees. So you want to decide where you want those trees to be. I'm sponging along some of my edges to make it look like there's trees that are coming out from behind the trees I already put in. You can drop in some color. On this one, I'm dropping in some of my cad red, but if you would rather drop in some oranges or some rust colors, you can certainly do that. You want to make sure when you do drop in some of these colors that your paint is still wet so that it will blend and bleed. You also want to take notice to where you have your best salting. Where you have your best salting, you don't want to cover those areas up with sponging because that salting has already given you some edges to some trees. So you don't want to ruin that by covering it with your sponging. Pick newer areas and you're actually outlining the tree because you want to do this in layers. You want your trees to look like there's some in the foreground, some in the midground, and some in the background. So you're not just putting your sponging everywhere. You want to actually outline your colors to make it look like what you're sponging in is behind another tree. But your sponging is so uneven and your lines are so uneven, it's defining two trees at once, the one in the foreground and the one that you're sponging in. Take notice to where you're sponging because you don't want your whole picture just to look like one big sponge mark. And when you are sponging, you want to change your position of your sponge. You want to move it both horizontally and vertically. You want to move your hand in different directions so that the impression that the sponge gives you on your paper with the paint is different each time. You don't want it to be the same marking every time you put your sponge down. Do a little bit at a time, especially with sponge work, you don't have to have it done totally, in one 15-minute period. You can sponge a little bit, allow it to dry, decide where you want more sponging, sponge it in and allow it to dry. Because again, you don't want your painting to look as if it's just one big sponge mark. While your sponging is wet, that's when you'd want to drop in some extra color. Maybe a little bit of sap green along the edges to make it look like the tops of the trees are still green or the base of the trees are still green. But you want to do that when it's wet. It doesn't mean that you have to use all sponge either. You can use your brush, and I call it squiggling, but you can just squiggle in some lines all along your sponge lines to add some more texture, to add some more leafage. Work on one tree at a time. Don't start sponging in one area and then hop to another area and then hop to another area, because you will lose what you're trying to accomplish. This area right here where my sponging worked real well, I don't want to ruin that. So I'm going to sponge around that to make it look as if there is a tree behind that sponged area. Your colors should remain lighter in color. You don't want to get too dark. So I'm using a lot of yellow ochre with some sap green, yellow ochre with a tiny little bit of burnt umber. I'm trying to keep all my different gold and yellow colors close, but not all exactly the same. You can drop in some lighter yellows, but you want to make sure that your paint is wet when you are dropping in those colors. You don't have to necessarily follow your picture. However, looking at your picture every once in a while will give you an idea of where you might want to add some trees to make it look more realistic. Don't cover all of your sky. Leave some of your sky come through. And remember, there's going to be a lot of branches and twigs going up into all this leafage. So you don't have to feel like you've got to cover every single section with leaves and sponging. There's going to be a lot of trunks of trees, branches of trees, little thin twigs. So your sponging can be less than you actually think you need. You can always add more sponging, but you don't want to lose some of the original colors that you put down. Down along the roadway is covered on the edges with leaves that have fallen. The same is true under all of these trees, the area on the left and the area on the right. That is all fallen leaves. So you want to fill that in too, because there's no light that gets down there. That has to be all color down there. In your background, that's where basically it looks like the road ends. The road actually doesn't end, it bends. But at the bend in the background, the trees and the foliage come all the way down to the road. So you want to make sure that that's all filled in with some nice color, because we will be darkening that to show the depth of the trees where that bend is. One of the taller trees I'm adding just some sap green to, and I'm letting that sap green bleed through the nice wet paint. It'll have a nice blend because the paint is already wet. And I'm using some plain sap now to put in at least one or two trees that I want to show that haven't quite turned yet. These are trees behind the other trees. I'm leaving my gold trees both in the foreground, in front of that sap green tree, and behind that sap green tree. You want to have your trees at different heights. You don't want everything to be straight across your paper. And again, remember, you can always add trees, add sponging, add thick brush lines, but it's hard to take it off. So you want to make sure that you don't get too aggressive too soon. And remember, you are putting in tree trunks, you are putting in branches, you are putting in twigs. So some of the places that look as if you need something, there's going to be branches, there's going to be twigs, there's going to be tree trunks. Now you want to start to deepen in where the bend of the road is. You want to allow it to look as if some of those golden trees are hanging over onto the road. So you don't want to darken that entire area. You want to strategically put your watered down black in the area close to the road. I dry brushed it vertically upward, but I left a big area of the original gold color to look like those trees were full and hanging over the road. So you want to be careful where you put that nice dark color. You need that dark color to show the depth, but you don't want it to go too much, too far up, because then you'll lose the nice gold trees that you put in originally. Again, anytime it's an area that you're not quite sure of, or you're not quite sure what you want to do with it, do it a little bit at a time. There's no hurry on finishing this in one or two strokes. You can do a little bit at a time, and when you get it to the point where you are happy with it, where it looks just like you want it to be, then stop. There is a very fine line between liking your painting, liking what you've done, and saying, oops, I did it wrong, I did too much, and then it's hard to fix. You can always add. So do a little bit at a time, especially with your darker colors, your shadowing. That's where, most people ruin a painting or don't like their painting anymore because of something they've done. So just do it a little bit at a time. You can always add. It's really important that, especially down in that background at the bend of the road, you leave some of your nice gold trees unshadowed, untouched, until it's time to put in the little tiny trunks of the trunks that are going into those trees. You're definitely not going to be seeing any tiny branches back in there. All of your tiny branches will be reserved for the front of your painting, or at the very most the midground. But you don't see any tiny branches that far in the distance. You can add some salt where you feel you might need to. If you have an area that you put paint on that it's just flat and you feel like you need some texture to it, put a tiny little bit of salt on and let that salt work. Now up in my upper right hand corner, I'm adding some rust color to make a nice big tree up there behind my gold trees. And that rust is yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of red and a tiny little bit of burnt umber. A lot of water. You don't want it to be too intense. I've painted in the corner and I am just sponging off the edge. When you do something like this, if it dries too light, you can just redo it. But you want to make sure that when you do redo it, that your paint is dry first. As long as your paint is wet, you can add more color, but you don't want to wait until it's almost dry to start adding color, because then you won't get a nice smooth color. You'll get washbacks. Of course, a washback in a fall tree picture isn't going to matter because it'll just look rough. It'll just add some texture to your picture. But you don't want to get into the habit of adding paint at the wrong time, because you don't want to get into the habit of creating washbacks. Now I'm starting to pick out areas that are holes where the sponge left. If there are holes that your sponging left and it's showing it as white paper, you don't want to leave it as white paper, because your sponge holes have something behind them, either another tree or a tree trunk or a dark colored bush. So you want to plan what's behind those holes and paint in those specific colors. You might have a beautiful gold tree in your foreground and behind it is a darker gold tree or even a sap green tree, depending on what you put in. So in those sponge holes, you want to paint in the appropriate color. Now when we paint in our roadway, I'm using some watered down black. I'm painting in the road, and I'm painting all the way up to my uneven edge on each side. You don't have to be exact, because any little white spots that you might leave, you can paint in as a colored leaf later. While your black road is wet, we're going to be dragging down some darker watered down black at an angle On the right-hand side from the back, coming towards the right, leaning towards the right, and on the left-hand side, starting at the back, coming to your left and leaning towards your left. Those are actually just the dirt lines created from the continuous traffic on that road. So those tire tracks, as I would call it, are just darker than the road itself. So while your paint is while your paint is wet, you want to add that extra black in, that extra line on the right and that extra line on the left. And then I also threw in a little bit of salt on my roadway, just to make it nice and rough. It's not really a dirt road, but it's about as close to a dirt road as you could get. You want to put in your color along the side of the road, some additional yellow ochres or some additional rust colors. Make sure that it shows where the ground is versus your background. Use this time also to maybe add in any little bits of color that you want, any little bit of the rust colors or oranges or lime greens. It doesn't look like very much right now. It looks like just a bunch of sponging. But remember, you still have to put in all of your tree trunks and your branches. And once you do that, that'll all come into place. You need a lot of tree trunks and a lot of branches to substantiate all of this leafage. You can't have all of this leafage covering 90% of your paper and having 2 tree trunks. You have to have enough that it will look realistic, that it's accommodating all of the leaves. You can see that I'm still filling in some of my white holes with the color that would be behind or be where those holes would be. Because on this part of your picture, from mid-ground down, there should be no white holes. There can be holes, but those holes should be filled in with color. Now you're going to start to put in your tree trunks. There's a lot of thin tree trunks, and there's a lot of thin branches. Your biggest, heaviest tree trunks are few and far between because they're in the foreground. Of course, it's just like I would teach my kindergarten class. The farther away you go, the thinner and smaller things look. So even though there might be quite a few big heavy tree trunks, you are not going to see them as big heavy tree trunks farther in the distance. So you're going to be putting in your tree trunks with black mixed with a little bit of burnt umber, and you're going to be painting those in. Again, less is better. You can always add. You can add tree trunks and branches, but if you get carried away and you do too many too soon, you might not be happy with your results. When you're filling in your spots to make it look like one tree is behind another tree, take your time. Do one tree at a time so that you don't get lost, and in the end it looks like everything is just all mixed together. Take one tree at a time, and when you do that, that way you will be able to actually see where that tree is from top to bottom and fill in what you need to fill in. You want to keep some of those original golds. You don't want to lose those, because those are the trees that'll draw your eye down the road. Your eye is going to follow the gold. When you're putting in your dark colors, you want to make sure that you are dark enough. You don't want your tree trunks to dry and look like a dark gray color. So you want to make sure, especially on those big trunks, that you're using black mixed with some umber, but that you can see them. When I'm putting in my tree trunks, I'm leaving some of the foliage in front of the trunk. So you don't want to just paint a continuous trunk line from the base all the way to the top. You want your trunks to be like a broken line. That broken line will make it look like there's leafage that is in front of the trunk. So all of your tree trunks, they can be like broken lines. But even though they're a broken line, you have to make sure that you leave some of the broken lines be broken in the same area so that you have bunches of leaves that are growing in front of your trunks. You don't want it all to be just a big broken line and then have just little teeny dots of yellow here and there or color. You want to have more color, horizontally to break up those trunk lines. Your trunks are all different widths. Quite a few thin ones because there's so many, and because they get thinner as they go in the distance. They don't all just go vertically. Some can be tilted. Some can be looked like they're falling over. Put in your trunks first, and then you can do all of your smaller branches. Remember, in that background at the bend of the road, there's trunks going to go all the way across that road, because all the way across that road is the bend. So you're seeing tree trunks going all the way across. You're going to be using different widths of of brushes to make different widths of branches. And your branches should not all be vertical. They should be like elbows and be broken and going horizontally across your picture to break up all of your vertical lines. Do a little bit at a time. Don't do too much too soon and then not be happy with where you placed all of your tree trunks. Because again, you've worked on this painting now for a long time and created all this beautiful foliage, and you don't want to ruin it now just with a few tree trunks. So do a few at a time and then stop, look at your picture, see where you want to put in a few more. If you need to, you can put your heaviest ones in with a pencil. I wouldn't bother doing that with all of your little ones, but if you have some of your bigger tree trunks and you're just not sure, you can put them in with a light pencil line. There are branches at the very top of your paper because the trees in the foreground are the largest trees. They reach to the top of your paper. So those branches, there will be branches at the very top of your paper. There's going to be very thin ones. There's going to be thicker ones. But especially towards the tops of the trees, you have to substantiate that with a lot of little thin branches. As you come from the back of your picture to the front, you have more tree trunks because you can see more, because the tree trunks in your foreground, of course, they're not so much wider, but there's more of them because it is in the foreground. As you move away from the foreground of your picture, there's a lot of smaller tree trunks, but they kind of blend together as you go towards the back of your picture. So you're not going to see all of those individual little lines. You can pull some of your branches across horizontally through that open spot you have for your sky. You almost want this to look like a tree tunnel, where you are going through all of these trees and they are growing above you overhead. So you want to pull your branches out that way also. Now we're going to be creating that beautiful shadow across the road. With some watered down black and your large flat brush, you're going to come down from your left-hand side or right-hand side because I want that to look like it's elevated. So I'm coming down to my road, and then I'm using that edge of the brush to go from side to side, leaving some openings because there are openings in the branches that allow light through. So I want there to be light spaces on my road. I'm coming down at an angle and going across my road at a little bit of an angle and leaving lines of unshadowed roadway to show that those trees have some spaces in between them. The area on the side of the road, it is really pretty much totally shadowed because of all of the foliage overhead. It doesn't allow for a lot of light there. You can leave some little spaces that have no shadow to them, but the majority of those side areas are shadowed in. But definitely leave some nice, long, unshadowed areas on your road. Your roadway, the shadows on your roadway are going to go all the way back, almost to that bend in the road. When you're looking at your road and you see those spaces of unshadowed road, then you know just by looking at that road where your big spaces are in between your trees. You know just by looking at the road and the shadows that you created where there are spaces, where there's no trees, or where there's just a few trees because you have space now on your road. As you go further towards the back of your road, you don't have to use your biggest brush anymore. I reverted to my rigger to get smaller lines for my trees. Again, you want to leave space on your road. That space is what causes the interest in this picture, because looking at that road, you know there's a lot of space in between those trees where that light is getting in. This shadow on the road is the most interesting part of your picture. I left my road unshadowed as I got closer to the background. I didn't want to lead into the darkest part of my picture back there with more dark stuff on my road. So I left that light so that my eye would be drawn back there, but it would be drawn towards the light. You want to make sure that you have a nice uneven shadow line on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, because that shadow is shadowing uneven foliage. So you don't want a straight, flat line. Finish up with your tiniest rigger to make your tiniest branches. You want to fill in where you have areas of a lot of foliage. You want to have at least a couple thin branches going through there to substantiate holding all of that foliage. So you want to make sure you have, if you have a lot of nice colored foliage, you have to have some branches to hold that up. It's not just hanging in the air, it's coming from somewhere. This road could be anywhere in the fall. It could be not only in where it is here in Pennsylvania, but it could be in Ohio, West Virginia. It could be in New England, anywhere, Colorado, where the beautiful trees are changing. This could be any road USA. You can leave this picture and come back to it a day later and still add some more branches where you think you might need them. Take the time to really look at your picture. If part of your painting looks like it's empty or it needs something, then it probably just needs some more little branches. But don't get too many big, thick black lines in your picture. You want your eye to travel down the road and not get stuck at a certain part of your painting that seems to be just all big black tree trunks. If you make thinner tree trunks, you can always widen them if you need to. You don't want all of your lines to be vertical. You need some of those lines to be horizontal, to cross over some of your vertical lines, to break up all of that just straight up and down, straight up and down. I love how my eye can just go right down that road. I can almost see where the bend is to the left, about the middle of the picture. But my shadow is taking me down the road. I'm following that shadow. I also like the nice bright yellow at the end of my road. Now, once everything is dried really well, you can remove any salt that you have on your picture, and you're also going to be taking off your misket. I usually just use my finger to rub my misket off, but you can use a soft eraser or whatever is comfortable for you to use to take your misketing off. Now, all of my misket's off, and in those misketed areas, I want to keep those nice and bright and clean. That's why I used the misket in the first place. So I'm using some of my watered down yellow ochre to paint in all of my misketed areas. And my eye will be drawn to these specific trees because number one, they're nice and clean. They've not mixed with any other color. They've not blended with any other color. They are just straight, plain yellow ochre. If you want, you could paint yours straight lemon yellow. If you want, you could paint yours with a nice peachy color, which would be your lemon yellow mixed with a tiny little bit of red. But I chose to keep mine just golden yellow, and I'm using my yellow ochre. Not only am I painting in the trees on the left and on the right, but I also misted some trees along this, or some leaves along the side of the road. So those leaves along the side of the road will also get painted in. This is the easy part because you just have to paint over the white areas. You don't have to decide where you want that extra color. It's already decided for you where you put in your misket. This is such a soothing painting. Just to look at this, you just feel so relaxed, like you're in your car driving down these beautiful country roads with all of this beautiful color around you. I definitely don't like winter. However, I do like summer and I love the fall. I like the crisp mornings. I like the warm afternoons, and especially on a sunny fall day when you can take a drive and see the most beautiful colors that you've ever seen. If some of your misted areas are rather large and solid, you can throw some salt on that color that you're putting on. All it will do is give you some extra texturing to look like some leaves. You can even add additional color if you want to. So if you're painting it in with like a yellow ochre color and you want to tip it with a little bit of watered down red, you can certainly do that. I'm just leaving mine the plain yellow ochre. I want my eye just to be drawn to that pretty gold color. Now remember also, if you are putting in your leaves that were misted along the edges of the road, if those leaves fall into the shadowed areas, once those leaves are dry, you have to shadow them. Or you can simply deepen whatever color you are going to paint those leaves with a tiny little bit of black, and they'll already be shadowed for you. But you can't have a bright yellow leaf in a shadowed area of the road. It will look out of place. So you want to make sure that if you have leaves that you are painting on the side of your road. You're filling in your misket area, and that misket area was in a shadow. You have to shadow those leaves. You can't leave them be real bright because they are also shadowed. Makes me want to get in my car and go for a drive. Look at your painting now, and if you think you need to add any more color, you can. But I cannot stress enough that less is better. You can always add, but it's hard to take off. So even if it takes you a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks to continually add little bits, it's better than overdoing it right away and then not liking what you've done. So take your time. Back in that area where the bend of my road is going to begin, I feel like I need some more branches, so I'm putting in some very fine branches. But again, these are things that you can look at now, tomorrow, next week, next month, and decide that you want to add something. It is so much easier to add a little bit, but it is very difficult to take it off. So a little bit at a time. Less is always better. I don't want that right side of my picture to be so even. I don't want that to look like all of my trees just started up at that roadway area. So I'm pulling some of my trunks down into the leaves that have all fallen. Those are the things that you can look for so that you have trees not just growing from one specific area. Some are growing closer to you, so you have to pull those trunks down. One of the last things that you're going to do is splatter. And I splatter with my hard fan brush. It's an oil fan, not a soft watercolor fan. And I'm just splattering by putting some nice wet paint on my brush and flicking it with my finger. You can do that both on the road, up in some of your trees. If you have a big spray of color in your trees and it looks a little flat like it needs something, you can splatter a little bit up in that tree using the same color as your tree. It'll just look like extra leaves. Here you go. Fall at your fingertips. Enjoy the fall. Happy painting.